Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have first-time guest Hugo Lowell with us today. We shall chat with Hugo in just a second, but first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow, subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So, Hugo Lowell is an award-winning senior political correspondent at The Guardian, covering the intersection of Donald Trump's 2024 presidential campaign and the U.S. Department of Justice. He regularly appears on MSNBC as a political and legal affairs analyst. He has led coverage of federal and congressional investigations for The Guardian since 2021, leveraging his deep sourcing inside the Justice Department, Congress, and the White House. In particular, Hugo was The Guardian's lead reporter covering Trump's criminal trial in New York, Trump's criminal investigations brought by the special counsel Jack Smith, and the House January 6th Select Committee investigation into the Capitol attack. His reporting has been recognized through appearances on NBC, MSNBC, CNN, CBS, and the PBS NewsHour and BBC News. He is a recipient of the National Press Club's Sandy Hume Memorial Award for Excellence in Political Journalism and was a Paul Miller Fellow with the National Press Foundation. Hugo, welcome into the back room.
Thanks for having me.
So, the release this week of the American hostages, Evan Gershkovich, Paul Whelan, and others who were held captive in Russia, is truly something to behold. It's quite emotional, especially the image of President Biden, VP Kamala Harris on the tarmac with these folks. It also presents such a stark contrast to everything else we've been experiencing. When you watch this unfold, and you see the leadership that was put forth by President Biden in brokering this, what does it make you feel? Not just as a reporter, but just as a person.
Well, I think on a human level, you have to be absolutely thrilled, right? You know, Evan's been in detention in Russia for 500 odd days. Mm-hmm. And for him to finally be out, especially when he was wrongfully imprisoned, is, you know, such a wonderful moment just as a human. I think as a reporter, though, the story is even more extraordinary, mm-hmm. Not least because of all the details that came out about how he you know, honed his Russian while he was in prison, when he wrote the formal letter that you have to write when you're in Russia to Putin, asking for clemency. He tacked on a request to interview him at the end. And of course, you know, the fact that he was imprisoned as a result of his reporting and his really hard-hitting reporting on Moscow and Putin's kind of invasion of Ukraine. You know, the story is just, it's such a fantastic story. And then you get like the political element of this and how Biden really managed to bring not just Evan home, but scores of other people home. It's like, this is the largest transfer since the Cold War. And for all of Trump saying, you know, oh, I would have been able to do this. Well, he didn't do it, right? Like, mm-hmm. That's the thing. He didn't do it.
And Biden reminded him of that.
Right. And the thing about Biden was, you know, in the midst of all of his domestic political issues, the weekend that he was deciding whether or not to stay in the presidential race, his first priority on the Sunday that he dropped out was to call up his Slovenian counterparts and urge them to get the process finalized so that this transfer could take place. And I think the cherry on top of this entire saga is how Putin repeatedly wanted his hitman back. And that was the sticking point for the longest time. The Germans didn't want to release him. Mm-hmm. And ultimately they did. But the contrast couldn't be more stark. You have Biden on the one hand trying to release, you know, families and reporters, and on the other hand you have Putin trying to get his hitman back. And the backdrop of all of this, of course, is that Trump is much more amenable to Putin, and Trump is, you know, has previously expressed that he would always believe Putin over his own intelligence agencies. And when you put it all into perspective, it kind of shows just what an extraordinary feat of political and diplomatic effort that Biden went through to make this happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned the stark contrast, and it was a week of monumentally stark contrast. Here you have the sitting U.S. president brokering the deal in the manner which you describe, showing compassion, showing empathy, being the consoler in chief with the families, hugging these former hostages upon their arrival. At the same time, we see Donald Trump at the National Association of Black Journalists convention in Chicago just being a sociopath and a racist. And so my question is, you see that, I see that, Democrats see it, perhaps, but the people that are needed to defeat Trump in November, how much do you think they see it?
It's a good question. I think it's difficult for liberals to sometimes comprehend the extent or the significance of certain events. I wonder if truly Trump's interview will have broken through to undecided voters and low information voters, which really are the only demographic which could actually be swayed probably at this point. And with respect to Trump, the people that his campaign is targeting are low information, low propensity white voters in particular. That was the demographic that Kellyanne Conway described as the hidden Trump voter. Mm-hmm. And they came out for him in 2016 and they basically put him over the edge just enough to get in the White House. And then they didn't come out in 2020 and he lost, obviously. And so when I think about it in those terms, while the liberals and like the MSNBC crowd and Democrats in general kind of see this for what it is, because it, to be questioning Harris's, racial background is just so beyond the pale. And it's the same playbook that he tried to employ in 16. It's the same playbook that, he used to spread the birther conspiracy lie with Obama. But I just, don't know if that breaks out of the media ecosystem that liberals are kind of inside. And B, I don't know that even if it does break out, do those low information, low propensity voters think, oh yeah, this is the one thing I'm now going to take to the bank and not vote for Trump. My fear is that it is baked in for them. They already see him as a guy that can't shut his mouth, and he says racist things. But at the end of the day, I don't like the border being, quote unquote open. We'll buy into his rhetoric about that, and we'll vote for Trump.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's certainly a really interesting take on things. And what it speaks to is that we tend to focus on how many Trump voters, or even the so-called voters in the middle, might be sick of Trump and move over to the other side. When you see how flawlessly the transition from Biden to Harris has been and the euphoria that it's created, I personally have just started to feel differently in the sense of maybe it's not about those people anymore. Maybe it's about just energizing the base so that Democrats turn out not in 55 to 60%, but 60 to 65% or 65 to 70%, because that's really what is needed. It's not about the Trump voters. We need to get out our own vote.
I think that's a good point, and I agree with you to a larger extent. I think there are two ways to beat Trump in November, and that is for people to hammer on about how much Trump is a threat to democracy, how he was responsible for overturning Roe because he placed those Supreme Court justices on the bench. And there's the appeal to the undecided voters. But to your point, there is also energizing and turning out the Democratic vote. It always astounds me compared to other countries, mm-hmm. how low voter turnout is in this country. I mean, if you think about somewhere like Switzerland, where there's 70-80% turnout for referendums, mm-hmm. like if you had that level of turnout in this country, Democrats would win every single time because mm-hmm. we just swamp what is a diminishing and slowly narrowing coalition for Republicans, but especially so for MAGA voters.
Well, you're speaking my language, so I want to ask you, Why do you think that is? What is it about people in Switzerland or other countries, Canada, Sweden, wherever, versus our voters? Why does our electorate, almost half of them, feel like they're either disenfranchised or their vote doesn't matter, and that's what keeps them home?
I have to wonder, and I'm not an academic in this, and I don't profess to have expert knowledge, but just as a layperson looking at it and having an above average, consumption of politics, I do wonder if a lot of this is the Electoral College. The Electoral College doesn't exist in most Western democracies.
That's a great point.
And in this country, it is always fascinating to me how people think, oh, my vote doesn't matter because I live in a blue state, or I live in a red state, or my district's gerrymandered. So I'm just going to vote blue all the way down the ticket, or vote red all the way down the ticket. And there does seem to be a kind of an apathy or a resignation to that. But I also think there's just not as much engagement. Maybe the election cycles are too long. Most Western democracies are much shorter. In the UK, it's it barely goes on for a month or two.
Right.
In France, it's it's like, what is it, 30 days, 6 days? It's very, very quick. And in this country, we have 2 years of this stuff. So I don't know what the root cause is. There's probably multiple, but I think all of which comes back to my point, which is if Democrats can turn out more people, Democrats can probably swamp the gain that Trump needs to carry an election. And if his caustic and race baiting comments at the NABJ conference is the catalyst for that, it could really set the tone for the next 96 or so days. And it is certainly true that the Trump campaign is concerned that this may take hold, and they are anxious of the comments and his appearance because they know it was bad.
And what we know from Trump is that the more his numbers go down and the more he feels threatened, the wilder he becomes.
Right, he lashes out. He lashes out.
Lashes out. The rhetoric becomes more incendiary, inflammatory, dangerous. And so we could almost chart her progress and momentum with what is likely going to be more of his insane, racist, inappropriate, dangerous behavior. And so when you look at it in those terms, it's hard to imagine by November 5th it being anything but some kind of landslide for her. But I very cautiously use the L word. I'm the most skeptical person in the world, and especially when it comes to politics, I prefer caution versus euphoria. But it feels like there's something different happening right now, and she's perfectly riding that wave so far. But there's 3 months left, to your point, 96 days, and we've seen how anything can and will happen.
I think she's got a lot of momentum, and I think this is the one thing that the Trump campaign, according to our reporting, was always very concerned by. Before Biden stepped down and withdrew from the race, I had multiple calls with senior advisors on kind of close to Trump who would say, we really don't want Biden to drop out because it's going to give Harris momentum, and she's going to, ride that wave through the convention, and we're going to be boxed out of the news cycle, and we're really good at manipulating the news cycle, but if we don't have it, we can't do anything with it. And that really has come to pass. The momentum has been extraordinary. I was speaking to another Trump advisor just yesterday, and there was this kind of concession that you could beat Biden with vibes alone, because it was it felt at times like two geriatrics in an old people's home, like arguing about golf. I mean, that was the TikTok takeaway of the debate. It was,
and that actually was reality, by the way.
It was, and
it did happen.
Democrats and liberals might not like that characterization, but I'm just saying, like, I'm not weighing in here. I don't have skin in the game, but that was the TikTok reaction. So if you want to talk about like young voters, that was what young voters saw. They saw two old people bashing out on stage, and they didn't really care. Now you have Harris, who is energizing. She leans into memes. She's kind of fun. there's this whole sweep, goodwill sweep, and that, or the tide, lifts all boats.
Megan Thee Stallion performing, like.
Yeah, and then you have the Charlie XCX, and then, you have the Brad Summer, and you have the Coconut, and then like people are doing Mario Kart, super cuts. It is very energizing, and the campaign knows you can't beat Harris on vibes in the way that they thought they could beat Biden, which means they have to do two things. They need to focus on policy, because that's the only real thing that they can hit against is her record in office as part of the administration, and her previous records in office, and having a better ground game. Trump, at the moment, does not have a better ground game. The Republican Party, in January, February, March of this year, before Trump took it over, restructured their ground game so that in such a way that it basically obliterated a lot of the preparations that the Republican Party and the GOP had laid, because Trump came and swept it all out. And so they find themselves 96 days to election, having to stand up a ground game if they want to do that, and trying to pivot messaging against Harris in a way that their own candidate doesn't want to. And when you see and hear about the Trump campaign trying to figure out how to hit Harris, I think that's accurate, because there is a disconnect between what the campaign wants, what Trump wants, and neither entity here seem to have a very clear idea of what they want to do yet. They have time to figure it out, right? Like I was saying during the convention, the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, when all the Trump guys are being like, oh, we got this in the bag. And I was like, well, it's not 100 days to go. It's not won yet on either side. And I think the same is true right now. Harris can ride all this momentum through to the convention. And she's been bolstered by the fact that, July and August are traditionally slow news cycles for the media. But once we get into September and October and it starts ramping up again, it starts getting very nasty, and you go through debates, the momentum will slow inevitably, based on the goodwill she's had alone. And she will have to create her own reason for turning voters out. And I think that's the test. We have to see how that plays out.
That's a really, really important point you're making, because it speaks to the reality of the Trump campaign, is that there is this enormous disconnect between the candidate himself and his campaign. The word surrogate basically means you're in a secondary position. You're helping execute the vision and working on messaging to support the candidate's views and overall strategy. Back in the day, if there was a situation like this, the surrogates, the aides, the consultants, all advisors sit down with the candidate and lay out a course correction strategy. And the candidate's like, okay, all right, I got it. That's not happening with Trump, and it'll never happen with Trump. His team can come up with the greatest reversal campaign in the history of politics. He's still going to go out in a rally, see that crowd. His heart's going to start pumping, and boom, we're talking Hannibal Lecter again. He's going to appeal to the lowest common denominator. So that doesn't change. We saw the whole pivot conversation after he was shot. Oh, he's going to go into the convention, and he's going to be the new and improved, shiny new Trump. Pivoting. It's not in him. He can't do it. So if history does repeat itself, which it likely will, it's just going to get uglier, more nasty, more belittling, more racist rhetoric. It's hard to imagine the people who Harris really needs not seeing that and going, I'm done. At the same time, Democrats are so supercharged and so excited to vote.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think if just because the campaign wants Trump to say something doesn't mean Trump will say it.
Right.
And this has always been the issue with Trump. And the campaign from its earliest days made a decision in this cycle not to try and be guardrails for Trump, because they just know it's impossible. And so they kind of have to bend and be flexible with how Trump says stuff. And I thought it was very interesting that the moment he got off the stage, the campaign realized they needed to do damage control, and they went and got all, Trump's black allies to go out in public and start defending him much quicker and much more instantaneously than they had planned to do. And that's always an indication that even they know an event has gone badly. Just one of the tells for the Trump campaign. I think the thing you say about Democrats being supercharged, I wonder if what Harris really needs to do is to present a vision that, you know, she is the next leader of the Democratic Party, and, you know, have like bring young voters out, or bring kind of people who might not otherwise vote out because they believe in what she's selling. And like, she's like, whilst not completely ignoring Trump, the mentality is almost like, you know, forget Trump for a minute. You know, this is what we want to do with our country. This is what, you know, the Harris campaign is all about. We're trying to, you know, we want to make sure that, you know, women have the ability to have an abortion if they choose. We want to make sure that, you know, there's more of a balance. You know, in the Supreme Court, for instance, if some justices retire in the next 4 years and has an office, and so like, by presenting a path forward and a nice and like an energizing vision forward, that brings out voters to new degrees and kind of swamps the low information white voters that Trump is relying on to carry him through.
That's a great point, because I think we're seeing that. I know it's only 2 weeks, but I think the initial euphoria was that she's not Biden. You know, like that was it, right? But I think she's creating her own narrative that I think is working really well. Can she maintain that over the next 3 months? Can she go into the heartland, the Rust Belt, appeal to the farmers, et cetera, like Scranton Joe did? That remains to be seen. But I do think she's well on her way to shedding the I'm not Joe and I'm not Trump thing, that she's really painting a picture of who she is as a candidate and how she wants to lead America. You brought up the court and the legal stuff, and I know that's part of your beat. And what's interesting is it's like no one talks anymore about that he's a convicted felon, that there's trials. Like it's almost like gone from our collective memory because there's so much other stuff. But I want to ask you, because there is a lot happening and will be happening with his other cases. You were in court every day during the New York trial. So I want to know what your biggest takeaways were, as well as what you think is going to happen at his sentencing. And then I want to ask you a couple of questions about the remaining cases.
So the conversation about whether he's a convicted felon, and whether, the fact that he's a convicted felon, and whether that, you know, that should be a part of the Harris's messaging, is something that you know, we've thought about long and hard. And the issue I think that Harris has is most of the country doesn't really seem to care. The polling basically didn't move after he was convicted. Mm-hmm. And while I think, you know, the fact that he's convicted is a big deal, like even anecdotally with focus groups and with polling, you talk to people and they go, well, you know, if he's a convicted felon, that's not great, but, you know, I also want my grocery prices to be lower. Mm-hmm. I also don't want people contacting my car. Like I also, you know, and there just seems to be not a great focus placed on that case, nationally speaking, which is difficult to wrap my head around, but like that's really the takeaway we get from talking to people. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't seem to be that big of a driver when it comes to voting. Like, I don't know, which is kind of personally disheartening to me, because I was there every day and, you know, I covered it, and it was a very strong case, and obviously it was a pretty fast conviction. I mean, the jury was in and out, and yeah, we got that conviction by the Friday, the week that the defense case in chief wrapped up. And so, but the writing, I think, is on the wall for both campaigns, is the convicted felon line has not resonated with the country writ large as I think a lot of people thought it would.
Do you think it matters more now because it's now the convicted felon versus the prosecutor? Like, does that?
I don't think it makes any difference at all. Mm-hmm. And I think actually it's stronger to make the case that, you know, Trump was responsible for overturning Roe v. Wade. Mm-hmm. I just do.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's my personal. Mm-hmm. That's my personal thinking on this. In terms of the cases, though, you know, there's something ironic that I was thinking about recently, which is Trump for the longest time was trying to delay all the cases. He was trying to get them out and just didn't want to deal with them before the election. But the cases brought him a lot of wall-to-wall coverage, which drowned out Biden. It drowned out his other primary contenders. And it also did him wonders for fundraising.
Mm-hmm.
Every time there was a big, bad legal headline, bam, you got a lot of fundraising dollars. His lawyers have almost done this too well that there might be very, very little legal news between now and the election.
That's interesting.
If there was a big legal story or something that was continuously coming up and the focus was on that, might help his fundraising. Might help take Harris out of the news cycle.
He's all about the victimhood and the us versus them. So you're 100% right there. It's an interesting way to look at it. Never thought of it that way.
I actually don't think there will be very much legal news. I'm prepared to be wrong, but as we stand here today, I do not think that there is going to be a lot of legal news through the election.
What about his sentencing next month? The sentencing in New York on the 18th, I think.
Again, I think, from a political standpoint, I think it's baked in. If he gets over sentenced and there is a perception that he's been over sentenced, that will be the sort of bad legal headline that he could benefit from, and to your point, play the victim card. If it's a lenient sentence, I just don't think it really makes any difference either way. If it's a lenient sentence, he's going to be like, look, clearly everyone knows that it wasn't a big deal. That will be his message, right. And Harris or whatever. I just don't think I think it's a blip in the news cycle. I think it will be maybe, a day of, maybe at best a week's coverage. MSNBC will go hard on it, but most of the country doesn't watch MSNBC.
Mm-hmm.
I've become more circumspect about the legal cases as a whole. I just don't know how much impact they will have. Look, this time last year, we thought he was going to be in a courthouse, every other month going into the election. We thought this was going to define the election.
So true.
I thought my job was secure for years to come, and now.
So it's all about your job security, isn't it, Hugo?
Well, I say that as part of a joke.
I know.
But
I'm kidding.
But it is remarkable the extent to which he has managed to evade accountability for all of his cases, including in the documents case, which is, my personal. The one that I have the most special interest in because, we'd covered that so aggressively.
But where does that case go? It's on appeal. It's going to land right back at the Supreme Court. What are they going to do?
That's a good question. So there is one element of Judge Cannon's decision that I thought was interesting, which was she draws this distinction between all the other special counsel and the special counsel in the Trump case. Mm-hmm. And there is one difference. All of the other special counsels were Senate-confirmed U.S. attorneys. Where there was David Weiss, where there was Robert Hur. Mm-hmm. They were U.S. attorneys that were deputized and detailed to be special counsels. The one exception was Jack Smith, mm-hmm. who obviously came from The Hague. He wasn't a Senate-confirmed DOJ prosecutor anymore when he took this post. And so there is... When we talk about, Judge Cannon ignored the dicta in the Nixon case, and she was ignoring the Watergate situation, there is that big difference. And there is the other difference with Watergate, which is in the Watergate episode, in the litigation, all sides are agreed that the special counsel was appointed duly and appropriately and mm-hmm. constitutionally. Mm-hmm. And so it was never actually briefed, and it was never contested. And Judge Cannon seized on that as an opening to say, well, that means I don't have to abide by Watergate, because there it wasn't, the appointment of special counsel wasn't under dispute. Mm-hmm. And not only that, but dicta isn't binding, and all the precedent that has come to date has been the DC Circuit and not the 11th Circuit. So there were multiple loopholes and openings for Cannon to thread this needle to dismiss this case. And I think you're right. For that reason, what we will have is it will go to the 11th Circuit next. I think the 11th Circuit will probably overrule Cannon and send it back. In which case, we're back with Cannon. Nothing changes. We're going to have the same slow rulings, the multiple evidentiary hearings maybe to go through what's official, what's not. She will presumably got a lot of the case based on the Supreme Court's ruling in the Nunity case. And if the 11th Circuit agrees with Cannon, then it's definitely going to go to the Supreme Court, because then you have split decisions between circuits. You have the 11th Circuit saying, yes, it's unconstitutional for Jackson to be special counsel, or the special counsel regs. And you've got the DC Circuit saying, no, it's totally fine. And so that is something for the Supreme Court to resolve. Either way, that case, not going to trial anytime soon, maybe not even next year at this rate.
And what about, there was some news I saw out of the DC election interference case today that with Judge Chutkan, she's getting the case back, and that looks like it could be moving forward, maybe with the goal of starting it before the election. Is that a possibility?
It's always a possibility. Look, the reason why it's taken so long for the case to come back to Judge Chutkan is because there's a 32-day waiting period that the Supreme Court allowed. It's 25 days, plus it's 20-something days. There's a period for rehearing, basically, which is kind of silly because everyone knows that neither party is going to seek a rehearing in this case. But the Supreme Court, in its ever-expanding wisdom, decided to tack on 20-something days to the decision, and then there's another week waiting period, and technically it goes back to 11th Circuit, and then 11th Circuit remands it back to the district court judge. In this case, it would be Judge Chutkan. So that waiting period is over. We've had roughly a month, and so it's going to enter Judge Chutkan's jurisdiction imminently. And then the question is, what does she do now? Well, she now has to figure out what parts of the January 6th indictment are official, what parts are unofficial. And, at the time that the immunity decision came out, we spent a lot of time talking about how will she make the determinations as what's official. And we had reporting at the time that the Trump lawyers intended to argue, or intended to argue then and still now, that they could resolve this on briefs alone, on legal argument alone, and that they didn't need witnesses. And even if witnesses did get subpoenaed, they would contest the subpoenas or say they can't testify. And it's not like this is not the most far-fetched claim that the Trump lawyers have advanced. They've advanced some really batshit stuff at times. This is not that crazy. In fact, I think this is what every defense lawyer would do, because they have some legal, grounding to do this. They can, even though the executive privilege and the speech and debate clause stuff's already been argued, if the special counsel tries to put someone like Mike Pence on the stand, or Mark Shaw, or Pat Cipollone, the White House lawyers on, Trump will say executive privilege. This is an executive privilege issue. We need to go litigate this first about what's allowed, what's not allowed. That could take up time. If Jack Smith goes, fine, we're not going to put executive branch officials up, we're going to put people like John Eastman up, private citizens, Mike Roman, a campaign official. Then we get into this issue of, well, they've all been indicted in Fulton County or Arizona, and so there are valid Fifth Amendment self-incrimination concerns here, and they can't testify either. So it's a real minefield, and I wonder how the special counsel is going to deal with this, because if they really wanted to just brute force fight it, they can. And they could think, the executive privilege stuff's already been previously argued and previously litigated, during the criminal investigation. And so, we'll take it head on, and we think we can resolve it in several weeks. And we can get evidentiary hearings late into the summer, maybe even in October. Maybe this is the October surprise that Trump doesn't want. On the flip side, it could take months, and you just don't know. Once you enter into litigation, you don't know how long it's going to take, what roadblocks are going to come up, what scheduling issues are going to come up. There is a lot of discussion about whether the special counsel could just refile the indictment through a different venue, through maybe the U.S. Attorney's Office or the District of Columbia, or maybe slim the indictment to win. I mean, there are no good options here if you're trying to get evidence out to the American public before the election. I think, unfortunately, how the Supreme Court has moved and how the judicial system has moved in general, it is going to be very, very difficult for there to be big open hearings. No one should expect anything close to the January 6th hearings, even if we have hearings, by the way. Remember, this is federal district court, no cameras. It's going to be a lot of it, if there's grand jury material, maybe it's sealed, maybe it's behind closed doors. It is not going to be the blockbuster stuff that we saw with the January 6th committee.
Right. And lastly, Georgia?
Dead in the water. I mean, just dead. I mean, and I'm sorry to say again, as someone who has covered that case for a very, very long time, and we reported on a lot of the criminal investigation as well. That is, I think we're set for the Court of Appeals in Georgia in December.
Now,
that is not moving anywhere.
Will it in 2025? Will it eventually see the light of day in a courtroom, or when you say dead in the water, is it literally dead in the water?
I think it is more dead than all the other cases. The Georgia Supreme Court is the Georgia Appeals Court is conservative, and the fact that they took the case and they set a long briefing schedule does not give me hope that they will say no, this is fine. This can go back to the trial judge immediately, and let's crack on with the prosecution. And of course, we're talking about in massive hypotheticals here, because if Trump wins, this is all going to be on hold for years, and at that point,
or dead, literally dead,
or literally dead for all of these cases. Right. I guess with the Fulton County one, he can't directly kill it in the way that he could the federal cases. And so we're only talking about if he loses. But even if he loses, these cases might not go to trial for a very, very long time.
Right. He is one lucky criminal defendant. My last question is a non-political question. It's a window into the soul question. Music is a great window into the soul. So give me your top 5 musical artists of all time, or just the top people you like listening to.
All time? That's tricky. Why don't I just go with this summer? I'm a sucker for TikTok music trends, just because I consume so much TikTok. I'm probably, my tastes and habits are probably getting consumed by the government, or maybe the Chinese government, who knows. Chapel Row and Hard to Go, man, it's just so catchy. It's just so good. It's the song of the summer. Charlie XCX Brat, fine, but Chapel Row, gotta love her. Sabrina Carpenter was big. We love catchy stuff. We also like the classics, Recently I was back on Oasis. I love Oasis. That's true. That's Don't Look Back in Anger. That's such a wonderful song.
Yeah, they were hot for a hot minute, and I think Liam Gallagher said Oasis was better than the Beatles. That was a bold declaration back in the day.
That's actually funny coming from Liam Gallagher. I think, especially because Don't Look Back in Anger, by his own admission, was a song crimped from like 50 different songs, which he amalgamated into his little, patchwork quilt, and it just turned out to sound amazing. And like, that is the, to me, that is the kind of song that, like, you're driving up the Intercoastal in Florida with the window down, and you're just like listening to this, and the world seems very relaxing, and all the political shit seems to be far away. But we love some Oasis.
They were great. I saw them live. Great band. Hugo, this was great. Love to have you back as we get closer to the election.
Thank you. This was like a really in-depth intellectual discussion, and now I feel smart.
Who knew? Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg, and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.